Howdy folks, this is Deacon Parsons. This is part 2 of the series, Real Traditional Relationships, Damsels, White Knights, and Industrialization. In this video, I'm going to continue what I consider to be an accurate definition of the traditional relationships and gender roles. Before we get too far along, I found a video supporting the economic side of my hypothesis, and I've linked it in the low bar below. The video is called Economics, What Caused the Economic Boom of Wealth. It's by Professor Deidre McCloskey, Professor of Economics, English History, and Communications at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I hope you'll pause this video and invest 3 minutes and 18 seconds to view her information before you proceed. Her data also points to the Industrial Revolution as a critical turning point in human society. Are you back now? Okay. Continuing from part 1, let's get a bit closer to our own time. The 30 years after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, about 72 to 73% of the people in the United States were farmers. That had dropped to 60 to 66% by about 1850. Now, by the time we get to the 1980s, only 1 to 2% of people in the United States were farmers. So, as far as the United States goes, the traditional relationship was that of a farm family. Now, I tried to find the percentage of farmers in 1939 and 1945 and other data points out there, but my Google foo is weak. If you have Mad Ninja internet skills and can produce these figures, I'll go ahead and link them in the low bar below. So what were the gender roles in the pre-industrialized farm in the United States? When drawing the line between men's work and women's work, the lines aren't as clear as most modern folks want to believe. The actual activity meant less than the reason and the duration that it was done. There were few, if any, female blacksmiths. The activity of working at a forge, swinging a hammer, is quite simply beyond the physical capacity of most women. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it was generally not something you would see. Working fiber into thread and cloth was so much of a woman's work that the name for an unmarried woman in the English language is spinster, i.e., someone who spins wool into yarn. Now, this is despite the fact that there were male professional weavers for hundreds of years. However, not all jobs were so well defined. We all have seen the films of native women grinding grain into flour to make the family's bread. This is women's work, but if a man does it as a commercial business, he's a miller. In the same way, baking the daily bread for the family was women's work. But if a man baked bread as a business, he was a baker. It's the same way on a farm. The man worked on the primary cash crops, the women worked on providing for the household needs, with perhaps a bit of extra money from some small overages she may produce. There would have been a lot of overlap. Men may have done most of the field work, but when harvest came, everybody in the family helped bring in the crop. I'm going to rely on a few sources for my explanation of the gender roles in a traditional family relationship. One is the traditions handed down to me by my own family. This is backed up by local Kansas museums. Another is a body of literary work that is unique, the Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House series of books. Okay, the necessities of human life are food, clothing, and shelter. In a pre-industrialized setting, women provided the food and the clothing and took care of the shelter. This was no small task. Imagine a world in which you have no electricity. No toaster, no microwave, no refrigerator, no freezer. No corner store with shelves of food. The production, preparation, and preservation of food was a very time and labor-consuming process that was usually done by women. Gardening was not a hobby. Gardening was life. While men may till the soil for the garden and perhaps help plant, for the most part, managing the garden was women's work. And I say manage and not tend. Remember, there were no seed catalogs. She had to gather and save seeds from one season to the next. She had to decide what to eat fresh and what to preserve. The gardens weren't tended, they were managed. The garden was the very life of the family. It had to produce and produce enough to store and feed everybody from one harvest to the next. If you ran out of green beans, you were just out till next season. The management expertise and talent for the production and preservation of food was essential to the family's survival, and most often in the hands of women. The keeping of chickens, rabbits, milk cows, pigs, sheep, goats, and all other manner of smaller livestock would have been either male or female work depending on the specific farm. If there was only one or two milk cows, milking might have been women's work. But on a dairy farm, milking would have been men's work. But that's a specialized farm. We'll continue our study assuming that grain crops are the cash crop of the farm. Tending chickens, gathering eggs, butchering chickens for the table would have been women's work. There may have been some overlap and with smaller farm animals with tending, fleecing, butchering being divided between men and women and circumstances as time allowed. Then we go from food production to food preparation. For food preparation, the women only had very basics purchased from outside. If a miller was in the area, grain would have been milled by him for a percentage of the grain. If not, women would have to grind their own flour. Salt would have been the primary purchased item. Sugar was a spice, not an ingredient. Coffee and tea were luxuries that would have been carefully rationed. The major food staple item that may be available for purchase would have been some kind of dry beans or other grains. Now let's consider the staff of life, bread. To have leavened bread, one first must have yeast. This wasn't something you went to the store and purchased. You either got some sourdough culture from someone else, or you had to go out and capture wild yeast and then start your own sourdough batch. Note, you can also use this yeast to make your own vinegar, which is used in cleaning and preserving foods. Like everything else a traditional farm wife did, this was managed without refrigeration. She had to keep her sourdough alive and thriving. Before the canning process was developed in the early 1800s by the French military, drying, salting, or root cellaring would have been the primary forms of preservation. If the family had extra milk and wanted to save it as cheese, the woman would have to know how to process an animal stomach to produce the rennet, to produce the cheese. A woman would have to try and preserve as much food as possible in the fall to last all winter. If those stores ran out, they were left with grains and any dried beans they might have around, supplemented with such animals as they had to butcher during the winter as their fodder ran out. Of course, once winter hit, meat could be kept frozen. In Kinsley, Kansas, there is a recreation of a sod house containing a spinning wheel and a hand mill to grind flour. In a museum in Lyons, Kansas, there is a spinning wheel specifically designed to be transportable in a Conestoga wagon. These were used by settlers just a couple generations prior to my grandparents. That means my grandparents knew the people that used these things. In the Little House books, we constantly read about homespun clothes. From time immemorial until well after the Civil War, women were spinning and weaving to produce clothes for their family, despite the fact that textiles were the first product to be industrialized. Now please note, it was the industrialization of textiles in Britain that made cotton king in the South, fueling slavery and the U.S. Civil War in the first place. Women made most, if not all, of the family's clothing. Earlier by spinning and weaving the cloth, later by purchasing store-bought cloth, unless and until a sewing machine became available and affordable, all the clothes would have been stitched by hand. Now we come to the shelter part of the equation. The construction of the home would have been mostly a male proposition, but the care and cleaning of the house would have been mostly female. We need to remember that a clean house is not just an aesthetic concern. The cleanliness of the house was the first line of the family's health care. Since there were almost no medicines or medical treatments to cure a disease after it was contracted, prevention was paramount. Now we come to the topic of children and family life. In a pre-industrialized world, not only were large families inevitable due to the lack of modern medicines, but children were a major labor force for the expansion and the success of the farm. That's why, as the cities industrialized, nobody thought anything about having children working in the factories. Children that age had always worked before on the farm. Children were a positive economic asset, not a liability for the family. And we must remember that without modern medical advances, a rather large percentage of women died giving birth. Many children did not live to become adults. Becoming a mother or just being a child isn't nearly as dangerous as it was just 50 years ago, not to mention a full century ago. Child care as we know it today was pretty much completely unknown. Infants were cared for by their mothers as mom did the huge amount of other work she had to do to keep the family fed and clothed. As soon as children were walking, talking, and able, they would be introduced to chores. Of course, lacking televisions, video games, and computers, working was really the only thing to do. First working with a parent, male or female, depending on the situation, then given chores of their own. It's important to remember that adolescence, as we know it, is a fairly modern concept. By the time a person was 12 or 13 years old, they would be expected to be able to do an adult day's work. Remember, Romeo's Juliet was only 13 years old. And it's worth remembering that in a traditional family, Dad didn't go to the office. He just went outside. Families ate all their meals together, they spent their work days together. The children were pretty much on their own, but within sight or earshot of mom and dad all day long. Pre-industrialized life was hard. It was very hard work for everybody except the top 1%. The vast majority of people in pre-industrialized societies were farmers. Before industrialization, the realities of life made the synergy of the gender roles benefit both partners equally. Each had a better chance of success with the other than by themselves. The traditional relationship is not male-centric, it is not female-centric. It is relationship-centric. There are 0 white knights and damsels in distress in a traditional family. So what caused the demise of the traditional relationship? When we industrialized what women traditionally brought to the relationship. We completed this process to win World War II. If you'll notice, in World War II, we didn't find the crowds of women following the armies that had always been there before. We industrialized the production of clothing. We industrialized the production of food. We industrialized the kitchens with refrigeration, gas stoves, dishwashing machines. We industrialized the washing of clothes with washing and drying machines. After the war, we began to sell all these foods and machines to consumers rather than to the military. When we did all this, we mechanized what the traditional woman usually brought to the family. We no longer needed a woman to have food and clothing. It was readily and cheaply available at a store when it had never been before. Instead of spending hours cooking, cleaning, and washing, we invented machines to do most of those chores. What used to take a woman all day could now be done in just a few hours. Take away all of this, what does a woman have left but her sexuality? Men didn't reduce women to sex objects. Industrialization of their traditional roles reduced women to sex objects. Thus endeth part 2 Once again, love your maker, love your mate, and do what's right because it's right, and devil take the hindmost.